Yeah, so here we go. This is the top 10 differences between the Bond novels and the Bond films. So I'm going to start with the small differences, and then they'll get bigger as we move on down the list. Number 10. Smoking and drinking. Now, in terms of the novels, you get a very clear indication of Bond's habits in the opening chapter of Thunderball. Despite many previous warnings, Bond admits to smoking 60 cigarettes a day. These are of a Balkan mixture with an higher nicotine content than the cheaper varieties. When not engaged upon strenuous duty, the officer's daily consumption of alcohol is in the region of half a bottle of spirits of between 60 and 70 proof. Now, the first time we see Bond on screen, of course, he's smoking a cigarette as well as gambling in a casino. So the introduction of Bond in Dr. No is a very faithful representation of the character from the novels. And Bond's habit of smoking is basically maintained over the course of the early films. Although when we get to the first two films of Roger Moore, he changes from cigarettes to cigars. And then from the third Roger Moore film, The Spy Who Loved Me, Bond basically completely stops smoking. Although it restarts again briefly with Timothy Dalton. But then Pierce Brosnan only smokes once, and then Daniel Craig don't smoke at all. But what about drinking? Well, Esquire magazine reported that over the course of all the novels and the short stories, Bond consumed 317 drinks in 14 books. And that puts him at an average of 92 units a week. By contrast, in the films, Bond consumes about 100 drinks. And that's over the course of 25 movies. Yeah, so by my calculations, Bond drinks about 6 times less in the films as he does in the novels and the short stories. In the novels and the short stories, Bond also consumes a greater variety of alcoholic drinks. So as well as the old vodka martinis, he also drinks bourbon, scotch, champagne and gin. In the films, of course, Bond has a preference for martinis.
A martini, shaken not stirred.
Although Moore changed things up slightly in Live and Let Die.
Bourbon, no ice please.
Drinking vodka martinis became part of the character again with Timothy Dalton. And then the character of Bond in terms of the films never really looked back.
Perfect.
Number 9. Gadgets. Now I should probably start by saying that the idea of the gadgets does actually come from the novels. The idea of the briefcase in From Russia with Love, for example, comes directly from Fleming. Yeah, so this is from chapter 13 of From Russia with Love. Q Branch had put together this smart looking little bag to pack 50 rounds of 25mm ammunition, a flat throwing knife and a cyanide death pill. But the thing is, the films massively increased the number of gadgets. I think Moonraker is a good example of this difference between the novels and the films. Because in the novel Moonraker, none of these gadgets even exist. So gadgets are occasionally in the novels, but to a much lesser extent. Number 8. The Germans. Now for this topic I can refer you to my short video called The German Connection. But basically the presence of Germany and the references to Nazism are reduced in the films. But there are a couple of exceptions. And the first one is A View to a Kill. Because this film adds the character of an ex-Nazi, and this is actually a character who ain't in the short story. His name, of course, is Dr. Karl Mortner, formerly known as Hans Glaub.
Selective breeding is important, Jan.
During World War II, he experimented with steroids on pregnant women in the concentration camps in an attempt to enhance intelligence.
And in the film, of course, Max Zorin, the main villain, is the product of this Nazi experimentation. This rather unwholesome duo is then repeated in Tomorrow Never Dies. First of all, you got the character of Dr. Kaufman.
My name is Dr. Kaufman. I am an outstanding pistol marksman. Take my word for it, yeah?
And then you got his sadistic surrogate son, an estamper.
The purpose of these implements is to probe those organs, inflicting the maximum amount of pain, whilst keeping the victim alive for as long as possible.
Dr. Kaufmann's record was 52 hours. I'm hoping to break it.
Number 7. Q. Yes, at this point it's very straightforward, insofar as there's no Q in the novels at all. There's only a Q branch.
Hello? Hello? Are you there?
Number 6. Sexual innuendo.
Washington. At the White House this afternoon, the president said he was entirely satisfied.
That makes two of us.
Now, contrary to popular opinion, there actually ain't too much sexual innuendo in the Bond novels. It's only really limited to the names of the Bond girls. So Ian Fleming came up with the name of Honey Rider in Dr. No, Pussy Galore in Goldfinger, and Kissy Suzuki in You Only Live Twice. But then the films added lots of Bond girl names that weren't from the novels at all. And S Bond girls like Plenty O'Toole, Chew Me, Triple X, Holly Goodhead and Xenia Onatop. And those are all Bond girls in the films that ain't in the Fleming novels or short stories. But the thing is, there aren't really sexual puns or jokes in the Fleming stories. You can take the example of Octopussy. Beyond the title, there are no sexual puns in this story, but there's a ton of them in the film.
Here, you may need this to play with your asp.
Fast.
Having problems keeping it up, Q?
I need refilling.
Of course you do.
Now, in the Timothy Dalton films, they sort of do away with sexual puns, but then it returns again with the films of Pierce Brosnan.
How do you take it?
Straight up. With a twist.
And then finally in the Daniel Craig Bond films, the comedy sort of switches from females to males, which reflects the broader changes in gender politics.
Well, first time for everything. Yes.
What makes you think this is my first time?
Oh, Mr. Bond. My leading character, James Bond, I never intended to be a hero. I intended him to be a sort of blunt instrument wielded by a government department who would get into bizarre and fantastic situations and more or less shoot his way out of them.
Number 5. Bastard Bond. Yeah, so what I'm talking about here is how Fleming identified Bond as an anti-hero. Insofar as he's got some negative character traits, and he's also very ruthless when it comes to how he completes his mission. And in general, Bond is a bit more ruthless in the novels and the short stories than he is in the films. Yeah, so in Chapter 7 of Dr. No, Bond asks Quarrel, did those two men get off alright in the Sunbeam? This is when Bond pays Quarrel to arrange a decoy, because Bond is worried that he's going to be killed by Dr. No's assassins before he has chance to complete his mission. So he hires these two innocent men that don't know what they're doing in order to function as a decoy, and they actually die so that Bond can survive. So it goes, the newspaper, The Gleaner, said that a Sunbeam Talbot had been involved in a fatal accident. The two occupants of the Sunbeam had been killed. Now Bond is at times quite ruthless in the films too, but he's never quite this ruthless. There are, for example, some ruthless moments in the film Dr. No, and the one that really stands out, of course, is Bond's cold-hearted execution of Professor Dent.
Mr. Smith and Wesson. You've had your 6.
But then in terms of Roger Moore, things are a bit more complicated, because there are times when the Roger Moore Bond acts like a complete bastard. There are a few occasions like this in The Man with the Golden Gun.
Ah, you're hurting my arm!
I'll break it unless you tell me where those bullets go.
Oh, I can't.
Try.
And then you also see this in For Your Eyes Only. But in general, the longer he was in the role, Roger Moore sort of scaled back on this aspect of the character. So his Bond is basically softer and a bit more light-hearted. But when Timothy Dalton took over, he sort of gave Bond his edge back.
You want it. You keep it, old buddy.
And Pierce Brosnan had his share of ruthless moments too.
For England, James?
No. For me.
Funnily enough, a bit like Roger Moore, the Daniel Craig Bonds are a bit uneven too. Because when we first see Daniel Craig's Bond, he certainly falls into the category of ruthless bastard.
You needn't worry. The second is... Yes. Considerably.
But then as the Bond films progressed, he tended to become a bit softer. So this aspect of Bond's character is not absent in the films, it's just very uneven. Whereas in the novels and the short stories, it's very consistent. Number 4. Girls. So the main difference here is that the Bond films actually increase the number of Bond girls and the amount of sex. Just think of Thunderball, for example. In that film you got Patricia Fearing, Paula Kaplan, Fiona Volpe and Domino. Whereas in the original Fleming novel you've only got these two. And now about another example. In You Only Live Twice, you've got Elga Brand, Kissy Suzuki and Aki. Whereas in the Fleming novel you've only got one Bond girl. So the films generally add additional Bond girls that weren't in the original Fleming material. Now in 2012, BuzzFeed released this article where they totalled up the numbers. But of course some of these actors starred in more Bond films than others, so it actually makes more sense to see it in terms of an average. So the average works out in this way. Yeah, so that puts Lazenby in pole position, just ahead of Moore who's in second place, with Connery and Brosnan in joint third. Now Dalton is slightly below in fourth place, and then you see Craig at the bottom who's struggling to get his leg over. Now I don't want to give the wrong impression about the Fleming novels, because in terms of Fleming, Bond is definitely a ladies' man. For example, he's referred to in this way in the Living Daylight short story. So a bloke at a gun range refers to Bond in this way, sort of fellow who got all the girls he wanted. And the opening chapter of Moonraker discusses Bond's habits when he's not on duty. Among his many pastimes, Fleming lists Bond's fondness for making love with rather cold passion to married women. But it's actually worth noting that in some of these Fleming stories, Bond don't actually get the girl. Yeah, so at the end of Moonraker, Fleming says this about one of Bond's failed relationships. He shrugged his shoulders to shift the pain of failure. The pain of failure that is so much greater than the pleasure of success. Yeah, so this time, unlike the film, Bond don't actually get the girl. They then simply part ways and the novel comes to an end. Whereas in the film, of course, he gets the girl.
007.
My God, what's Bond doing? I think he's attempting re-entry, sir.
Number 3. Continuity. So the first point to make here is that the films are in a completely different order than the novels and the short stories. But in addition to that, there's also more continuity between the Bond novels than there are between the films. So you can take the example of the Dr. No novel. So this is novel number 6, and it's the one after From Russia with Love. So at the end of the novel From Russia with Love, Bond is actually poisoned by Klebb, and Dr. No picks up after these events. So in chapter 2 of Dr. No, M is on the phone to this bloke called Sir James Maloney, and M asks him about the identity of the poison, and Maloney says this: the drug was Fugo poison. The Japanese use it for committing suicide. It comes from the sex organs of the Japanese globefish. Trust the Russians to use something no one's ever heard of. So the films in general are less concerned with continuity. Each film is like its own separate, standalone adventure. Well, almost, because there was an effort to establish continuity when George Lazenby took over the role for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. You can see this both in the credits that contain clips from earlier films, but then also with Lazenby when he looks over his gadgets from previous missions. So we see Honey Rider's dagger from Dr. No, the watch from Russia with Love, as well as the breathing apparatus from Thunderball. Then with a couple of the more films, they refer back to the events of On Her Majesty's Secret Service. You got one reference like this in The Spy Who Loved Me.
Many lady friends, but married only once. Wife killed.
All right, you've made your point.
You're sensitive, Mr. Bond.
About certain things, yes.
And then also at the start of For Your Eyes Only. Plus there's one other reference like this in License to Kill with Timothy Dalton.
Is there something wrong?
He was married once, but it was a long time ago.
But then when Daniel Craig took over in Casino Royale, we got a reboot. And then complicating matters further, there is a sort of internal consistency between the various Craig films. They sort of follow on from one another more than the previous Bond films did. For example, someone could watch From Russia with Love without seeing Dr. No, and they would understand everything that was going on. Whereas certain events in Spectre, for example, only really make sense if you've seen the previous Craig films.
You came across me so many times and yet you never saw me. Le Chiffre, Green, Silva.
All dead.
That's right. A nice pattern developed. You interfered in my world, I destroyed yours.
Number 2. The Cold War. So the subject of the Cold War is in the films, but the Cold War themes in the novels are more direct, because the main antagonist of Bond and the free world in the novels is Smersh, and not Spectre. And Smersh, of course, was a real counterintelligence operation in Soviet Russia. So the criminal syndicate of Spectre don't actually appear until the 9th novel, and that's Thunderball. And even then it's a much smaller organisation than it was in the films. This is where we hear of Blofeld for the first time. So during his debriefing, M says to Bond, no one's ever heard of these Spectre people. The Cold War theme also makes its presence felt in the novels because Fleming is much more directly critical of Russia. You can see the anti-Russian sentiment in the novel very clearly in the way that Red Grant is described. Yeah, so Fleming says this about Grant in chapter 2. He liked all he heard about the Russians. Their brutality, their carelessness of human life, and their guile. And he decided to go over to them. You can also see this different sort of treatment in the Goldfinger novel, where Goldfinger himself is a foreign banker for Smersh. So in chapter 7 of Goldfinger, M says to Bond, do you know 007, I wouldn't be at all surprised if Goldfinger doesn't turn out to be the foreign banker, the treasurer, so to speak, of Smersh. So the Russians are always behind everything in the Fleming novels, which makes perfect sense of course, given the Cold War context, but it's a very striking difference from the films. In addition to that, like Goldfinger, in the Live and Let Die novel, the Russians are also behind Mr. Big. Mr. Big is also a Soviet agent. And finally he is, and this will particularly interest you, Bond, a known member of Smersh. So in the film versions of Goldfinger and Live and Let Die, there's no connection to Russia at all. So the films in general avoid any direct criticisms of Russia. Gogol, for example, is often a fairly sympathetic character.
My government categorically denies the incident ever occurred. However, we request Commander Bond to return one of our most historic national treasures, the Romanov Star.
In the interests of our Anglo-Soviet relationships, I'm sure that can be arranged.
And when Russia does cause problems in the films, it's normally a rogue element acting outside the official orbit of the Kremlin. This is the case in Octopussy, as well as The Living Daylights. In addition to all that, it's also worth pointing out that Fleming is often also critical of England's role in the Cold War, because he thinks England's gone too soft. As for England, the trouble today is that carracks for all are the fashion. We don't show teeth anymore, only gums. Number 1. Conservatism. So the vision of the novels is much more conservative. After all, Fleming had a very conservative politics. By today's standards, it would probably be described as far right. For example, Fleming is critical of the welfare state, with the underlying idea that it leads to weakness. Fleming is also quite critical of the modern world and Britain's youth. So have a look at chapter 2 of Thunderball. This youth, thought Bond, makes about £20 a week, despises his parents and would like to be Tommy Steele. It's not his fault. He was born into the buyer's market of the welfare state and into the age of atomic bombs and spaceflight. He's also concerned about the decline of the British Empire, and he can sometimes be transparently racist. Now, some of these comments are probably too strong for YouTube, but as an example, just look at Diamonds Are Forever. Bond had a natural affection for people, but he reflected how lucky England was compared to America, where you had to live with the problem from your school days up. Fleming is also quite sexist on occasion. So look at chapter 11 of Thunderball. Women are often meticulous and safe drivers, but they are very seldom first class. Fleming is also very critical of lesbians and gays, so look at chapter 19 of Goldfinger. Tilly Masterson was one of those girls whose hormones had got mixed up. He knew the type well, and thought they and their male counterparts were a direct consequence of giving votes to women and sex equality. As a result of 50 years of emancipation, feminine qualities were dying out, or being transferred to the males. These of both sexes were everywhere. Now, sometimes in the Connery and Moore Bonds, there is an effort to portray Bond as a sort of reactionary conservative figure, but this is very occasional compared to the novels, and it never goes that far, and it certainly never touches on the theme of imperialism or the decline of England, for example. I think they were trying to introduce this sort of idea when Connery makes this comment on the Beatles in Goldfinger.
My dear girl, there are some things that just aren't done, such as drinking Dom Perignon 53 above a temperature of 38 degrees Fahrenheit. That's as bad as listening to the Beatles without earmuffs.
And then he also says something derogatory about women swimmers in Thunderball.
Your name's James Bond, and you've been admiring my form.
Most girls just paddle around. You swim like a man.
And of course Moore makes some negative comments about women drivers in The Spy Who Loved Me.
Women drivers.
As well as Egyptian builders.
Egyptian builders.
So there are occasional moments of this sort of characterisation in the films, so it's not completely absent. You also see something of this with the characterisation of Bond by Pierce Brosnan in GoldenEye, when M refers to Bond as a relic of the Cold War.
Because I think you're a sexist, misogynist dinosaur, a relic of the Cold War, whose boyish charms, though wasted on me, obviously appeal to that young woman I sent out to evaluate you.
Point taken.
Yes, so there you go, that's the end of the top 10. There's not really much of a pattern. It's more that the films just downplay some things and then play up other things. It comes down really to a question of emphasis. So the films have less smoking and drinking, they have more gadgets, and with a couple of exceptions they more or less get rid of the German connection. They add the character of Q, they have more sexual innuendo, Bond is slightly less of a bastard, they got more girls, they got less continuity, they got less commentary on the Cold War, and the conservatism, which was so much an essential part of the Fleming vision, is more or less completely absent. I guess the general synopsis would be that the films are less political and more geared towards entertainment.
007 secret agent pen and disappearing vapor paper separately, or packaged with a 007 secret agent ring and ID bracelet. You'll get a bang out of it.